Hi, I'm Meta Spencer, and today we have a real treat. We get to talk with Ambassador Bob Rae at the United Nations, which is a thrill for all of us, I think. Ambassador Rae is known to every Canadian in the world, and having been in New York for a few months, I expect he's known to just about everybody else in the world by nowadays. Hi, Bob Rae.
Hello, Meta. Nice to see you. Nice to be with you.
Yes.
Pleasure.
It's a real treat. And we have three people with us who are going to ask you some questions, if you don't mind, about human rights, the topic of the day. And I imagine a good part of your working career now involves human rights activities. We have here the first person who's going to ask you a few questions will be Charles Burton, who is a Canadian diplomat who's, I think, lived in Canada, in China, a good part of his life and has a home there. So Charles Burton is in St. Catharines, I think. Hello, Charles Burton.
Thank you for having me on your program again, Meta.
Yes, it's always fun. And then we will have a little time for Paul Copeland to talk with you. I think you're old friends.
Yes,
and,
indeed.
Yep.
Say hello, Paul.
Hi, Bob. Hi, everybody.
All right, very good. And then we will go to Belgium, where Calixto Avila is sitting at his organization's website, I gather, and it's an organization called Provea. And he is a Venezuelan human rights NGO who's been working on these issues for many, many years. Good morning, Mr. Avila.
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you very much.
Let's have a start off with one of the issues of the day, where I think we already have had a statement by Mr. Romeo Dallaire yesterday about the plight of the Uyghurs, and Charles Burton knows their situation well. So, Charles, you're on.
Well, thank you very much, Meta. It's a great honor to speak with our ambassador to the United Nations. In his interview yesterday on the CBC, General Dallaire has suggested that the Canadian government is showing a lack of statesmanship with regard to addressing the Uyghur genocide. Now, to my understanding, China has ratified the Convention on Genocide in 1983, I think, and but like so many of the conventions that China ratifies, it refuses to accept any kind of review by the International Court of Justice. And then there are also genocide provisions in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, but China, of course, is not a signatory to the Rome Statute. So my question for you, really, as Canadian ambassador to the UN, is: do you see any way forward for the UN to effectively stop the genocide by the government of China against the Uyghurs and Turkic Muslims living in the Northwest? Is there, in the past, Canada has expanded the responsibility to protect doctrine, but I'm not seeing any particular movement on the part of Canada in the UN specifically to try and put an end to the horrors that the Uyghurs are suffering under current conditions.
Thanks, Charles. It's good to see you again, and good to be able to talk to everybody. I appreciate it very much. I think the first thing is, it's a couple of things I just want to sort of put on the table. The first one is that there are many, one of my first interventions in the General Assembly had to do with a response from the government of China to a statement that somebody else had made, and in the course of which they went after, Canada for taking its positions on human rights, and the principal objection of the government of China was that these are internal affairs of China, and they're nobody else's business. Mm-hmm. This is not a new argument. It's not a new approach. It's held by a great many other countries at the UN, including Russia, certainly including Syria, and the debates we've had around those issues. And in my response to the ambassador, I said, look, the fact is that whether it's the Convention on Torture, whether it's the Geneva Convention, whether it's the Convention on Genocide, whether it's the jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice itself, member states like China have in fact accepted the notion that there is no such thing as absolute sovereignty. There is no sovereign protection from the review of the world and global institutions like the International Court of Justice on human rights. And in all of the cases that we're going to be discussing today in Myanmar and Venezuela, the response from the regimes is the same. And the response from Canada and a number of other countries, and I'll come to that in a moment, is also the same. And that is, there is a thing called international law. There are institutions that are in place to enforce international law, and now is the time for us to be reinforcing that and making that very, very clear. The second thing I want to say is it's not so much what Canada does on its own as it is what Canada does with others. And whether it's the interventions in Myanmar or what's happening in Venezuela or what's happening in China, Canada cannot have very much impact on its own. We can have far more impact to the extent to which we're able to persuade others to come with us, or frankly, to which others are able to persuade us to come with them. So I respect General Dallaire. I know him very well. We served together in Parliament. He was a member of the Senate. I was a member of the House of Commons. I work with him very closely on issues around child soldiers at the United Nations. I'm here simply to say there are steps that have to be taken that the government of Canada is taking before any final decision can be made about how we're going to be engaging with the International Court of Justice or other institutions. Charles, you mentioned the International Criminal Court. The problem we have with the International Criminal Court is that there are 70 countries in the world that have not signed on to the Rome Statute. China is one. Myanmar is another. Venezuela is, you go down the list, you see, here we have a problem. The governments have not accepted the jurisdiction of the criminal court, and the way that the Rome Statute is structured, that limits the ability of the criminal court to take jurisdiction. On the Genocide Convention and the International Court of Justice, we're already in court. Canada is supporting the Gambia and has already filed together with the Netherlands a clear indication that we're going to be participating in that hearing. I think one of the things we've learned from the Rohingya situation, and I was, as you know, I had something to do with the approaches that Canada has taken, is that it takes a lot of time to document what we say is happening, what we believe is happening, that goes beyond newspaper reports and other kinds of accounts, and has to be based on information that can then become evidence. And the key challenge we face, it's going to take time. It's not going to be an instant process. But when you're saying, is there something that can be done? The answer is yes, there are steps that can be taken, but they have to be systematic. And they have to be well organized, and they have to be well thought through in terms of how they're presented. But I think it's also fair to say that there are a number of countries at the UN who, for example, there were 39 countries last year signed a statement that took clear issue with the way China was handling the issues of the Uyghurs, Tibet, and Hong Kong. And China took great offense. And made their own statement. But to suggest that somehow we're sitting on our hands is really not accurate. We are actually addressing it. It's not, it doesn't lead to instant action. But when you're looking at something as complex as a genocide case at the International Court of Justice, you don't just leap into it. It has to be based on an approach that says we need to gather the evidence, and we need to do the work. And that's exactly what Minister Garneau has said he wants to do, and that's exactly what we're doing.
I mean, China, of course, as you know, took a reservation on the provisions of the Genocide Convention with regard to the International Court of Justice, so they don't accept the jurisdiction. I think that, certainly in terms of whether or not genocide is taking place, the report released yesterday by the New Lines Institute and the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights, of which I know you are a supporter and member, is pretty convincing and includes an endorsement by Yves Fortier, the former Canadian ambassador to the UN, and 3 former Liberal cabinet ministers, Irwin Cotler and Lloyd Axworthy. So the idea that China denies that there is genocide doesn't really stand up. But you did refer to the 39 countries that supported the idea, but of course, China was able to rally a larger number of countries that opposed the idea. So when one looks at a situation where China is a member of the P5, is able to mobilize, more countries than we can with regard to this issue, will not accept the jurisdiction of either the ICC or the International Court of Justice. Is it possible for us to actually do any implementation of anything like the responsibility to protect in the context of the UN as it stands? And so, if Canada does rally together countries to engage in some common action, China is not likely to end the genocide. If Canada does get a condemnation through a legitimate basis, it could be as similar to China's response to the International Court of Arbitration in The Hague's determination that China is in gross violation of the UN Convention of the Law of the Sea, where China rejected a over 400-page decision as a worthless piece of paper. Is the UN able to function as an effective body in enforcing the Genocide Convention, which was in fact the founding convention of the institution? Is there any hope?
Of course there's hope. It's just not easy, that's all. I mean, Charles, all you're describing is how difficult it is. Yeah. You're saying China is a superpower. China doesn't like other people commenting on what they do. China behaves in an arbitrary way. We know that. And is it tough? Yeah, of course it's tough. The first year we put out the statement, we had 24 people signing on. Now we have 39. So you don't give up. I mean, this is not about giving up. This is about understanding that these things are tough. The R2p Doctrine is the same. I mean, R2p is a very well thought out and positive way of saying that countries have a responsibility to protect their own people, that the neighborhood around has a responsibility to make sure that it happens, and that the international community has to come in and do something. Okay, you've got a nice building, you've created it, it's painted, it's well nice, it's there. How do you actually do it? And the answer is with great difficulty. China won't accept the principle that they're doing something wrong. They vociferously reject it. The neighborhood around China is not about to do much. And globally, we're facing a challenge that China is very powerful. But does that say something about the UN? All it says about the UN is that the UN is made up of a number of countries, many of which are very authoritarian, are not remotely democratic, and have no intention of changing their ways easily. That's not the fault of something called the UN. It's as has often been said, you don't blame the Air Canada Centre when the Maple Leafs lose. I mean, the fact is it's the team. It's the countries that make up the UN that are the problem. And the countries that make up the UN are a mixed bunch. And so this is a world in which we live in. This is the swimming pool I'm in every day. And you just have to figure it's not easy. It's the pool is full of sharks. And so you swimming in it is difficult and sometimes dangerous. But it's not as dangerous for us diplomats as it is for the people who are living in Xinjiang. And that's, I think, where we have to keep our focus. There are terrible human rights abuses taking place in China today. And we have to continue to work every possible angle we can to get them to stop. And I don't think anybody thought it would be easy when we started, and I don't think we should think it's going to be easy now.
And so, what would be the next steps in terms of the UN? I think certainly the international community is moving towards some sort of likely unified action in terms of sanctioning the Chinese officials who are complicit in the genocide, some of whom have assets in Canada. But where do you see it going in the time ahead, and how long before you sort of see movement on this file?
I think that what's happening now is that there are very active discussions among a number of governments about what more can be done and the steps that need to be taken together. I think it's fair to say that the election of President Biden has changed the dynamic of some of those discussions. We are actively talking to the United States, but we're also actively talking to a number of other governments about the steps that they are looking at. And I think there's a broader consensus that it's what we do together that matters. It's not so much one country saying, well, I'm going to do this, another country saying I'm going to do that. And one of the themes that I'll be building on today is very much that's how we have to act. And we don't necessarily assume that the international institutions are going to do it on their own. We're not precluded from taking our own actions, but our own actions will be much stronger when they're done in concert with others. And that's exactly what's happening now. As we speak, those are discussions that are underway, and they will continue to be underway, whether it's on China, Russia, Myanmar, Venezuela. These are all active cases that we're looking at, saying how can we be more effective in pursuing the protection of human rights.
Well, I certainly, on behalf of my Uyghur friends here in Canada, really pray that we can move as expeditiously as possible to save those people. I've seen documents that suggest that the Chinese government has a 40-year program to eradicate the Uyghur tumor or threat, and and it's already underway. So I think there is a high degree of urgency in terms of making this a priority for our Canadian foreign policy. And thank you very much for all your explanation.
It is a priority, and I think it's something we all have to keep working at.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now let's shift to another part of Asia. Paul Copeland is very exercised. He sends me messages every day. Now, you probably are on his list too.
I get the same messages, Meta, don't worry. They're good messages.
Talk to us about Myanmar, or as you prefer to call it, Burma.
Okay, what I would like to do is do a little bit of history of my history in Burma and the history of the Rohingya in Burma, and then pose a question to Bob. I've been involved in Burma stuff since I first visited the country in 1988. I was back 4 more times over the years. I've worked a lot with Burmese people here and internationally on democracy issues. In 1820, the British took over Western Burma, maybe in the East India Company, and brought in the Rohingya to farm in there. When the country gained independence in 1947, they were granted citizenship. The military took away their citizenship in 1982, I'm sorry. In 2013, there was some fighting that went on with the Rohingya and the military, and 100,000 of them were ended up in an internally displaced persons camp in Burma. In 2017, there were some very serious attacks done by the military. They claimed that they'd been started by the Rohingya, although I don't believe that. 700,000 of them fled to Bangladesh to join people that had already gone there. Bob Ray did a report for the government of Canada on the situation of the Rohingyas. Gambia has brought an application in the International Court of Justice, which is ongoing at the present time. On the 1st of February of this year, the military did a coup which took over the government, which had been The elections in November had been won by the National League for Democracy, led by Aung San Suu Kyi. So the situation is that there's 700,000 in IDP camps in Bangladesh. Some of them have been transported to an island that to me sounds pretty horrible. So my question to Mr. Ray is, what, if anything, is going to happen, particularly given the coup that Burma is under a military dictatorship again, and that their military is killing people and locking up lawyers there. So with that little introduction, Mr. Ray, please give me your thoughts on what might, if anything, happen that will be productive for the Rohingya.
Thank you, Paul. I mean, first of all, thank you for your work over many, many years. You and I have been talking about Burma and Myanmar ever since you first went. I did some work with the Forum of Federations where we were acting as an NGO on governance issues. Forum is still going strong. And that was really my initial contact with Myanmar. I visited in the earlier part of about 20 years ago, and then again in 2015. And then the Prime Minister asked me to go back and engage in some work on the Rohingya, as you've said. I mean, again, I think it's a huge challenge for us. I mean, the failure of Myanmar to make a successful transition to democracy. Everybody talked about how there's a transition, and I said, we don't know yet whether there's going to be a transition. What we know is that the military fashioned a constitution in 2008, which protected their power perpetually. And eventually Aung San Suu Kyi said, okay, I can live with this. I need to get back and join into the democratic struggle. And she basically decided to come back from her situation under house arrest and to lead her political party in the next available election after doing an agreement with the generals as to how that would be done. But from my observation in 2017, when I met with her and was able to speak with her, I've just got to turn off this. What I know is a crank call. It's one of the. If I see it somewhere in California, I know that it's just somebody trying to sell me something. Anyway, so when I met with Aung San Suu Kyi in 2017-18, I was very disappointed because the Rohingya issue for her was not a big deal. It was a particular part of the country where she felt there were security issues and the army had acted appropriately, and I needed to get educated on what was going on. And I then proceeded to have meetings with the army and have the meetings with the Rohingya and go up into the camp and go into the IDP camp in Sitwe that you talked about. People have been there since 2012, and the camp in Cox's Bazar where people have been there since 2017. And I saw what was clearly a humanitarian tragedy, but also an act of brutal discrimination and indeed genocide, in my opinion, on the part of the Tatmadaw against the Rohingya. And then appallingly, frankly, from my point of view, Aung San Suu Kyi then ended up defending this situation in front of the International Court of Justice, where I was also attending as an observer. And I think that caused the reaction to her from the rest of the world that we know only too well. But the short and long and short of it now is that the military has shown once again, as if they ever needed to, it didn't need to persuade me, that this is a brutal, frankly, criminal enterprise that has run the country for 60 years and has conducted itself in total disrespect of the human rights. The lives, over 60 people have now been killed on the street. Like you, Paul, I'm getting daily reports as to what's going on and how bad it is. And again, I think the what's required is as much joint action as possible from a number of countries who are willing to take a leadership role in engaging in opposition to the coup and in providing whatever support we can to the incredible courage and resiliency that we're seeing from the people of Myanmar. I mean, it's quite extraordinary what's happening. People who have no access to weapons. The civilian population, we have a general strike going on of the population. We have a withdrawal from work of millions of people, and you have a military regime which is responding with brutal force. And I know the questions that you can ask are the same as the one that Charles asked. Well, what are you doing about it? And the answer is, well, we're carrying out a process of sanctions, but we're also carrying out a whole engagement with other countries is to say, what further steps can we actually take? And here's where we come down to the dilemma, because as a result of the isolation of Myanmar after 1960, we thought we were quote isolating Myanmar. What we weren't. What we were doing was driving them into the arms of the Chinese, who were only too happy to say, you know, we're there for you, and a number of other countries who invested quite substantially in Myanmar, particularly Asian countries, and saw them through the period of sanctions and everything else to the emergence of the Aung San Suu Kyi government in 2015. And we have to be aware of that now. We have to realize that as a result of geography and economics and the actual situation on the ground, Canada, for example, does not have much leverage in Myanmar. People say, why can't Canada get the government to do this? And you say, we have no tools to do that. We don't have the people, we don't have the money, we don't have the influence. Acting alone. Acting together, we have some, but not enough to overthrow a government. The only people who can really change the government in Myanmar are the people of Myanmar, with as much support as we can provide them to be able to make that change. And I think that's the struggle which is underway right now. I don't believe that the coup will succeed in the sense of, is this a permanent end to the emergence of democracy? I don't believe that. I think there's just too much going on the ground, and there's too much deeply ingrained commitment on the part of the people of Myanmar to their future. But we have to act together. We have to work together, and that's what we're doing. Is it having great effect? Not as much as I think any of us would like, but we have to keep working at it, and that's what we're doing.
Paul, you will have to pursue this?
No, I mean, I'm just after the coup happened, just totally frustrated in any hope for the Rohingya, and very little hope for anything meaningful happening in Myanmar in the near future.
I think
if I could just say one thing, I'm still a director of the Law Society, and we're trying to get the Human Rights Monitoring Group to put out a statement, because there's some serious repression going on of lawyers in Burma or in Myanmar.
Totally. They've arrested some of the leading human rights lawyers in the country. They prevented Aung San Suu Kyi's lawyer from seeing her. They've put up a bunch of bogus charges against her. There's a lot of things that are happening that are absolutely criminal in nature, just the way they're conducting themselves. And I think we like to say there's nothing we can do. You say, well, yeah, you can actually describe it. You can say this is what's happening. I mean, I was in the General Assembly 10 days ago when the Myanmar ambassador spoke, and I met him, talked to him before, and I wasn't totally shocked by what he said because I had a sense of what he was going to do. But he showed tremendous courage, and there are a lot of other Myanmar diplomats around the world who are joining him and who are not going to support what the regime is doing. This is causing way more of a stir, I think, and a reaction than the military thought was going to happen. There's no way they thought this was. They thought they could just get away with it, and that people would believe them when they said, "Don't worry, we'll have another election in a year. We're just here to kind of deal with a problem with the last election." There was no significant problem with the last election. They lost the election, and Aung San Suu Kyi won the election, and that's what they didn't like about it. Mm-hmm. But this is why I say the coup is a coup. It's not a constitutional move by the army. It's a coup. And we need to describe it for what it is.
Mm-hmm. My concern is that in this thing that's going on with the government now, we had become disillusioned with Aung San Suu Kyi, but now she's the victim that we have to protect, and her party and so on. And it looks as if the concern about the Rohingya has to not only take a back seat, but it be put on hold while some of the other, issues are being fought. Am I mistaken in seeing that these two issues are almost perceived as contradictory?
No, I don't. I think. I'm not sure I agree with you. I mean, I don't know whether you're mistaken. I always start every conversation thinking maybe I'm mistaken. I don't know. But my sense is that something is happening which is kind of interesting. And that is, you got to remember that in addition to the resistance among the population living in large urban centers in Myanmar, the Bamar people who live in Yangon and Mandalay and the other major cities, there has been since 1947, 48, a fighting force in every other region of the country. The Chin, the Kachin, the Karen, in Shan State. If you think of Myanmar as a horseshoe, you've got the part of the horseshoe that goes right around the country in mountainous areas, and those people are not putting up with this. They have been engaged in military action against the government of Myanmar for many, many, many years, whatever strike the government may have, and they haven't gone away. The peace process which Aung San Suu Kyi took charge of in 2015 has not gone anywhere, done much. And so those people have come together. And during the Rohingya crisis, there was slowly but surely a change in their thinking, in the thinking of those groups around the Rohingya. And they began to realize that they were part of the Rohingya. The challenge facing the Rohingya had also faced them. It was also facing them, and they needed to figure out some common ground. And I think that's taken hold now in the democratic movement in Myanmar. I think that Aung San Suu Kyi won the last election. She should be released from prison. She should be able to take the office that she won. But I think that she will inherit a democratic movement, which will be different than the one that she thought she was leading when she went into prison for this recent time. I think that I have not given up on the ability of the Myanmar broad political system to come around to the idea that the protection of the Rohingya is actually something they need to do as well. Maybe that's just too optimistic, but I don't think it's impossible. Well, and that's certainly what we should be aiming at. Canada certainly is not dropping its support for the Rohingya or for the dealing with the challenge that they face inside Myanmar as well as in Bangladesh.
Well, that's the nicest thing you've said all day, because I had the contrary opinion. My assumption was that most of the people who had been themselves victims in these struggles, these ethnic wars, so to speak, and who were immigrants or refugees in Canada, were very supportive of the oppression of the Rohingya. And if you're saying that they're coming around, they're seeing the connection between their own predicament and that of the Rohingya, the similarities, and learning something from this experience. Well, that's good news. I don't know whether
it's complicated. I mean, I'm not pretending it's simple. I mean, I think that as Paul laid it out in his brilliantly put together capsule of the history of Burma, of modern Burma. The issue around the Rohingya is really an issue of identity. It is about, are you one of us or are you part of somewhere else? And when I, when I think of the Rohingya, I think of the Roma in Europe, where there are many, many countries and nationalities and ethnic groups in Europe that say, well, the Roma are not part of, they're not part of us. They're foreigners. They're outsiders. And I think that the problem that the Rohingya face is that they are a people who whose history and relationship to Myanmar dates back at least 200 years, and some of them who are Muslims living in Rakhine State have been there for hundreds and hundreds of years. So to say that they have no connection or no identity or no relationship to Myanmar is just not true. It's so you then start from the premise that says, these people have to be included. But I would observe that in the British Empire in Asia, a lot of boundaries and borders were taken down. A lot of freedom of movement took place. And when national movements of liberation in India and Pakistan and Bangladesh and Burma happened, there was a drive to reestablish borders and boundaries and to say, we insist that these people are not part of us and those people are not part of us. And these debates and these issues are happening throughout Asia. And it's a little present that the British Empire has left behind. And it's Afghanistan, Pakistan, the border lines that were created by the British. It's a function of empire. It's not just the British Empire, the French Empire, same thing. And we're living with the consequences of that. And the new world in which national groups, ethnic groups say, well, the British did this, or the French did this, or some other country did this to us. That's not who we are or how we think who we are. So it's complicated, and we have to work it out.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you. That's an upbeat kind of an analysis, although complicated, as you say. Now let's go to Belgium and meet Mr. Avila. And I have not had a conversation with him yet about what his position is. It may be that the people he's representing are more favorable toward Canada's position than the two people who've been sort of scolding you for not doing more. I don't know. Let's see what happens. Calixto,
I don't consider Mr. Burton or Mr. Copeland to be scolding me. It's fine. I'm a big boy. I can take it. Don't worry about it.
Okay. Well, I farmed that task out to them so that I wouldn't have to scold you myself. So there you go. Okay, Calixto Avila, you're in Belgium. Please sort of brief us on your situation. I know that you're concerned about the conflict over who's the real government in Venezuela, and tell us whose side you're on and why.
Yes, I thank you very much for the opportunity. Thank you very much, Ambassador Ray. Yes, of course, we are a human rights organization, so we are more focused on the situation, on the humanitarian situation in Venezuela and the human rights situation inside the country. Of course, we really appreciate all the role played by Canada in this in trying to reach a solution to the crisis in Venezuela. we know that Canada has played a key role, for instance, in the setting of the Lima Group, who is one of the best actor in trying to reach a political solution to the crisis. And also we know that Canada is play a vital role in the beginning of the preliminary examination at the Office of the Prosecutor in the ICC. And there is a preliminary examination in Venezuela called Venezuela 1, and it's focused on crimes committed in Venezuela since 2017. And of course, Canada has played this role despite the fact that there is no embassy open in Caracas, because the embassy of the Canadian embassy is closed. But in spite of this activity of Canada, the Maduro government is more and more close. And for instance, in December, we had the last elections on the new National Assembly, which is considered as not free and no accord, and there is not full respect of international standards and even the national standards in terms of constitutional standards. So the fact is that we are facing a humanitarian crisis with more than 5 million of migrants in the region. We are also facing a crisis in human rights in internal terms, but all the action of the international community seems to be not enough to solve the crisis, and seems to be not enough to change the dynamics in the power. So we know that now the government of Maduro is more and more consolidated in power, and civil society is more and more persecuted by the establishment. But what other actions can be set by the international community if the situation starts being more and more established in terms of there is no changes in the short terms? So I know that Canada has been playing a role as an independent actor, but also playing a role in terms of international collectivities, so with other countries in the region, and even as member of the United Nations at the United Nations Forum. But what we can expect to do if the situation is not changing, in spite of the fact that there is a very important activity of the international community? That's a little bit my question.
Well, I think, and I appreciate very much your question, and I appreciate your perspective, because I think it's important. Of course, there's a debate in Canada, as there is elsewhere, on the nature of the Chavez-Maduro experience, governments. The response from a number of countries, the United States, Canada, a number of other governments around the world, within the region, within Latin America, South America, there are countries that are part of the Lima Group. There are countries that are not part of the Lima Group, and it's complicated, but it's not that complicated, because I think what's been behind Canadian policy pretty consistently has been our commitment to democracy, and our commitment to freedom of speech, and our commitment to diversity of opinion, as we have seen it and experienced it in Venezuela. And I don't want to get into a long history or debate around stuff, except to say that the facts that you've described are ones that I think are very clear. There is a humanitarian crisis, as there often is in situations like this. There are 5 million Venezuelan citizens who have felt the need to leave the country in recent years. Before, over many years, there was a vast exodus, significant exodus of Venezuelans, but principally, I would say, people who were better off and who chose to leave the country and move to the United States or to other parts of Latin America or elsewhere. That was the first big exodus. But the exodus we're seeing now, which is much bigger in terms of numbers, 5 million of people, are working people, working families, poor people who've lost everything, who have nothing, and who have crossed the border over into Colombia and into Brazil and other parts of Latin America. We have a huge presence in Peru. We have a huge presence in Ecuador. We have a big Venezuelan group that's moving up through Central America, and there's further instability in Central America, which we could. It's all connected to what we're seeing and what we have to understand is happening. And one thing that I think is important for Canadians to know is that there's a significance to our engagement on this as a country because of our membership in the OAS and because we are an American country. We are a country of the Americas. And there are many Canadians who often haven't thought of themselves this way. They think of ourselves as, connecting more to Europe or connecting to Asia, but not necessarily to connecting to Latin America and to the Americas. But we are part of the Americas, and having joined the OAS and taken the interest that we have in governance throughout the Americas, we've become quite implicated in this discussion. I think it's fair to say that the hopeful assumption of a number of countries, including our own, was that the congressional leadership led by Mr. Guaido would actually be able to be successful in a democratic encounter with the Maduro administration. And that hasn't happened. That didn't happen. And I think it's an indicator for everybody to notice that if you are in power and you have control of the state and the apparatus of the state, that's a lot. And opposition forces that may seem to be influential are not as influential as they think. And actually, there's quite a strong comparison in this regard between Aung San Suu Kyi and Mr. Guaido and their relationship to state power, because state power in Myanmar and Venezuela was in the hands of the fundamentally forces of authoritarian forces, supported by the army and by the military, and the civilian opposition was not able to overcome that. And so we're now living with the consequences of that. So what's happening? Well, again, everyone is reassessing. The Lima group is regrouping. And we have meetings in New York. We have meetings in the OAS in Washington. We have lots of discussions going on in a number of different places as to how do we respond? I mean, one of the things we're doing, Canada is very much involved with the refugee situation in Colombia. We're profoundly supportive of the government of Colombia for what they've done. They've indicated that 1.7 million refugees in their own country will be allowed to stay, will be allowed to work, will be allowed to get education, which is a huge decision. Same things are happening in a number of neighboring countries. Peru, Ecuador, and others are being very positive, but we are also assisting in that process. And we're helping to fundraise for that process at the UNHCR. The Minister of International Development of Canada is leading the efforts to raise awareness and to raise funds for the activities of the international agencies that are involved in the situation. But I would say this, and this is not intended to get into too big an argument, but any notion that there's somehow something romantic or progressive about the Maduro regime is, I think, quite misplaced and quite mistaken. And there is some of that. There are some people who say it's a socialist government that socialists should be supporting. And I would say, if you have an ounce of democracy inside your bones, you can't support the Maduro regime because there's nothing remotely democratic about it. It's an oppressive government. There's evidence of torture. There's evidence of extraordinary abuse of power. There's unilateral, arbitrary, authoritarian actions by the government that are completely incompatible with any notion of democracy, and we need to come to grips with it. However, we also need to come to grips with what is the current situation, and I think that's something which our government and every other government is assessing right now. What is the best and most effective way to respond? But we're not backing off on our view that there are issues of accountability and impunity that need to be looked at, and that's why we've been involved with looking at what are the international legal steps that can be taken. But we also have to look and see, well, what are the Europeans prepared to do? What are the Americans prepared to do? How can we be a constructive player in those discussions? But we are very involved in those discussions, and I think that's important for you and your supporters and around the world to know.
Could I ask about your views about sanctions? Because there's a debate within, I believe, among Venezuelans as to whether that's a good thing or not.
Are you asking me, or are you asking her again? Well, my view on sanctions is that we should be very careful in sanctions policy with any country to make sure that the impact of the sanctions is not falling primarily on the least well off in the country. Mm-hmm. And the other aspect of sanctions that I think we always have to be looking at is, are they effective? Are they actually doing what we think they should be doing? Or are they making the situation worse? And are they in fact strengthening the hold that the government has over the people? And I think that's something we have to look at as if I may be permitted to say so, as a factual issue, and really assess it on a factual basis, because frequently sanctions are called for. And one of the things we've developed is this concept, and Charles referred to it with respect to China, is the concept of Magnitsky sanctions, as they're called. That is to say, sanctions that are targeted directly at individuals who we have every reason to believe a degree of responsibility for a particular situation or abuse of human rights. Those sanctions, I think, can be quite effective with respect to the impact they have on those particular situations.
And are morally certainly more defensible than some of the other questions about who's going to be hurt most.
Well, that's where I think it's both a moral question and a practical question. The moral question is this the right thing for us to do? Is this sustainable? But the second question is it actually being effective? And I think that's something which governments have an obligation to assess all the time. And I think it's something that our own government has indicated publicly is looking at, not just with respect to the situation in Venezuela, but with respect to all of our sanctions. Mm-hmm. Where is the burden falling, and is this effective? And that's something that's being reviewed, to my knowledge, is being reviewed all the time. And that's the way it should be. It should be reviewed, assessed.
Right. Okay, we have just a couple of minutes that I'd like to invite anybody who has a burning question or comment you'd like to wind up with to toss it in. Who has something you want to...
Maybe I can add something before about the sanction, because we are, as human rights organization, we support the request of the High Commissioner, Madame Bachelet, to how do you say when you try to take out the, not to apply the sanctions, just to because she's asking to lift the sanction, the sectoral sanctions, and we support this demand, because we know that the effect of the sanctions inside the country are worsening the situation of the population, of course. But we have to do the difference between these sectoral sanctions and individual sanctions to human rights, responsible of human rights violations, for instance. And we support this kind of sanctions because we consider that this is something useful to solve the situation in the country and to send a strong message to this kind of responsible. So we are supporting this kind of thing. But one thing, another thing is when a government like the government of Maduro is using the sanctions to banish his own responsibility in terms of corruption, for instance. Yes. Because Venezuela has a very strong problem of corruption, and they are saying the government is saying no. Is the sanction the responsible of the current situation of the humanitarian crisis? Are the sanctions the responsible of this, but not the years and years of corruption with very high income from petrol revenues. So I think it's very important to do this difference and to know how this kind of regime can use the sanctions as an excuse to say we are not responsible. The responsible is another actor, not the government.
Can I ask whether the Lima group is reassessing the question of sanctions? We don't know. The public doesn't know what you guys are talking about. You know.
Well, what we're talking about is how can we assist in what is an appalling human rights situation inside Venezuela. And when you're asking, are other governments assessing their sanctions? Well, Secretary Blinken has already said that they're looking at sanctions as it impacts on humanitarian situations in a number of countries. And I think that will include Venezuela. So a number of countries are doing what we're doing. Precisely for the reasons that have been described, that you've got to make sure that what you're doing is effective. And I think that's something that has to be assessed on an ongoing basis. The Secretary General of the UN has also asked everybody to look at them because of the impact of COVID. And COVID-19 is having a major impact in Latin America, including Venezuela, including Colombia. So we have an obligation to look at that in the way that I think Canadians would expect their government to.
Indeed. Anybody else?
Well, I'd like to thank Mr. Ray for giving us a sincere and honest account to us ordinary Canadians, taking out an hour of his time. I've been a long-time admirer of Mr. Ray, and I think he's an excellent representative of Canada in the UN. And thank you for speaking to us today.
Well, thank you, Charles. I appreciate it. I really do appreciate the chance, and I have to say, as ambassador, the government has encouraged me to engage with Canadians on issues of our foreign policy and human rights as we see them at the UN and elsewhere. And I appreciate that they've given me this this license, and I also make a point to try to engage with as many representatives of civil society, of student groups, university webinars, all of the opportunities that are made available through the miracle of Zoom. I mean, one of the things about the only positive thing I can think of about what the technologies that have arisen during COVID are that the technologies have made it much easier for us to communicate with one another very directly and to encourage a dialogue between officials and civil society and citizens around the world. And I think that's great. I think it's really important.
I think every one of us actually celebrated when we heard that you were going to be the UN ambassador for our country. It's a real a good choice, and I'm really happy that you're there. And I'm very, very grateful to you for spending time with us and clarifying all these issues that need so much more work. Appreciate your work. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Meta. Nice to talk to you. Appreciate it. Our guest, nice to talk to you.
Okay.
I agree with Meta's sentiments.
Mucho gusto.
De nada.
Thank you.
Okay, it's been lovely.
Thanks a lot.
Everybody. Take care of yourselves.
Thanks for organizing it, Meta.
Thanks, Meta. That was great.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, Stephanie.
Thank you.